They didn't find it during a police sweep. No detective uncovered it. No anonymous tip led them to it. It was buried at the bottom of a dusty plastic storage bin, wedged behind towers of folded children's clothing that nobody had disturbed in months. A single envelope. No name on the front. No address. Just 6 handwritten words that made every investigator in the room go cold, not to be opened unless something happens. Inside, the ink told a story that no courtroom had ever heard. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, the kind of penmanship that only appears when someone's hands won't stop shaking, and the mind is racing faster than the fingers can keep up. This was a mother writing from a place of raw, unfiltered terror, a place most of us will never visit, and if we're lucky, never will. Her name was Malehya, and in that letter, she didn't speak about birthday mornings or bedtime routines or the small, golden moments that parents hold on to forever. She spoke about escape, about getting her children far away from Daniel, no matter the cost. She wrote about watching him change, about something shifting behind his eyes that she couldn't unsee and couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't witnessed it themselves. She wrote about sounds in the night, questions her son Jack asked that she didn't know how to answer, and a creeping dread that had moved into their home and never left. And then, near the bottom of the page, where the ink had blurred as if something would have fallen across the words, she wrote the sentence that stopped an entire room of seasoned investigators cold. If you're reading this, it's already too late. For days after it was discovered, Child Protective Services held that letter in their hands. Held it, read it, deliberated, and the public heard nothing. Not a whisper, not a statement, not a single word. When the spokesperson finally walked to the podium and faced the cameras, the silence in that room wasn't just tension. It was grief. Grief for every moment that had passed between when those words were written and when they finally reached the light. Because Lily and Jack Sullivan had been missing for days. Their home had been sitting with doors left barely closed, phones going unanswered, a community checking their screens every hour hoping for something, anything, that would tell them the 2 children were safe. Their neighbors couldn't sleep. Their teachers couldn't focus. And the town of Pictou County, already stretched thin from days of uncertainty, was about to crack wide open. When the CPS spokesperson finally stepped forward, you could feel the weight pressing down on every person in that room. She didn't open with reassurance. She didn't soften the blow. She looked directly into the cameras and said what no one was fully prepared to hear. This is a deeply troubling document. She went on. The letter, she explained, outlined a premeditated plan. A plan to remove the children from their home. A plan born from a specific, named fear about someone both Lily and Jack knew well. The letter, she said, strongly suggested the writer believed harm was not a distant possibility. It was coming. The shutters on the cameras barely clicked. The journalists barely moved their pens. Because this wasn't procedural update. This wasn't routine case language. This was the first public confirmation that there had been a window, a real, tangible window of opportunity to intervene, and it had closed on everyone without anyone realizing it was open. That letter had been sitting in a storage bin for weeks, and the children were still gone. The question that began swirling through Pictou County in those first stunned hours wasn't just about Daniel Martel or about Malehya or about what really happened inside that house. The question was larger and uglier and far more uncomfortable than anyone wanted to face. How many times did someone see this coming and look the other way? The answer, as investigators were about to discover, was more than once. The letter itself was barely a page long. Less than a page, actually. But every sentence inside it had the density of something much heavier. The kind of words that settle into your chest and don't move. It wasn't typed. It wasn't careful. There was no second draft. No crossed outlines where she reconsidered her phrasing. This was first thought writing. Survival writing. The kind you produce when you believe time is actively running out. The paper showed it. The handwriting sloped downward across the page as if even the letters were exhausted. Words crowded against each other, pressed tight, as though she was racing to get all out before something stopped her. The ink had bled in places, pooling in small dark patches where the pen had hovered too long, the hand pausing mid-thought, maybe listening for something in another room. And near the bottom of the page, a faint smear, a blur in the ink that forensic analysts would later confirm was consistent with moisture. with a tear, falling and dragging the words slightly sideways before drying to the page forever. Malehya didn't sign her name. She didn't need to. The first line she wrote was this: "They don't know what he's capable of." 6 words. No context given, no introduction, no explanation of who they referred to. CPS? The police? Neighbors? Future readers holding the page with gloved hands in a fluorescent-lit office? The ambiguity of that sentence is what made it so devastating, because it could apply to everyone who had ever interacted with Daniel Martel, and walked away thinking nothing was wrong. Everyone who had filed a report and marked it resolved. Everyone who had stood in that doorway and not looked closely enough. She continued. I've seen the change in his eyes. That line doesn't read like metaphor. That reads like testimony. It suggests a before and an after, a specific moment or series of moments where the man she had once allowed into her home and trusted around her children became someone she no longer recognized. Something had shifted in him, and whatever she witnessed during that shift had burrowed deep enough into her memory that she felt compelled to record it, not for therapy, not for a diary, for evidence, for whoever might one day need to understand what she had seen. And then, at the very bottom of that page, the line that made the room go absolutely silent. If you're reading this, it's already too late. Too late for what? Too late to stop whatever was already in motion? Too late to get the children somewhere safe? Too late for her? Investigators turned that question over and over. CPS confirmed the handwriting was unquestionably Malehya's. No forgery. No coercion. Her pen, her hand, her words. But the silence that followed the letter's creation, the weeks it sat undisturbed in that bin while Lily and Jack disappeared, transformed those words from a warning into something that felt more like prophecy. Because here's the unbearable part. This was not the first warning anyone had received. CPS had visited that home before, multiple times. There were welfare checks triggered by neighbors too worried to stay quiet, anonymous tips that had come in from people who noticed things they couldn't fully articulate but couldn't fully ignore either. One report documented faint bruising on Jack's upper arm, marks that formed a pattern consistent with a grip. It was officially attributed to rough play. A teacher filed a separate observation, noting that Lily, once a bright and talkative little girl, who lit up every classroom she walked into, had become silent, withdrawn, and visibly reluctant to hold anyone's gaze. The observation was logged. No follow-up interview was ever scheduled. Medical records raised flags. A physician noted possible signs of neglect after a routine examination and flagged a report for follow-up. That follow-up never came. The caseworker didn't provide the requested details. The report was left marked incomplete, and when the accumulation of all of these signals should have forced an escalation, when the pattern should have screamed loudly enough to trigger immediate intervention, the cases were instead downgraded, marked low risk, visits reduced. Each reduction was a door closing. Each closed door brought Lily and Jack one step further from safety, and now they were gone. The letter raised questions that nobody in Pictou County had clean answers for. And the more people turned those questions over, the more uncomfortable they became. Because on the surface, a mother writing a letter to protect her children sounds like courage. It sounds like a woman doing the only thing she could in an impossible situation. But investigators weren't looking at the surface anymore. They were looking underneath it, and what they found there didn't settle neatly into any single narrative. Why was the letter hidden so deeply? If Malehya genuinely feared for Lily and Jack's lives, if she believed with every fiber of her being that Daniel Martel was capable of something irreversible, why did she fold that letter into an unmarked envelope and bury it under children's clothing in a storage bin? Why not leave it somewhere visible? Why not hand it to a neighbor, a teacher, a pastor, anyone whose eyes would find it immediately if something went wrong? The letter was addressed to no one. It named no recipient. It gave no instructions for delivery. It was hidden in a place so inconspicuous that investigators almost missed it entirely and only found it weeks after children vanished. That detail alone stopped people cold. Then came the second question, the one that felt even harder to sit with. If Malehya's fear of Daniel was real enough to document in writing, why was there not a single legal action on record against him? Not one restraining order filed. Not one emergency custody petition submitted. Not one formal complaint lodged with law enforcement bearing her name. In all the paperwork that existed around that household, around those children, around the repeated welfare checks and medical flags and teacher observations, Malehya's own voice was conspicuously, almost completely absent. People who defended her said that silence made perfect sense. That fear operates like a cage. That a woman living under constant threat doesn't always have the luxury of making noise, because making noise can get you or your children hurt faster. They pointed to the letter itself as proof that she was trying, that she was reaching for something, even if that reach never made it past the storage bin. They saw a mother paralyzed by circumstances too heavy to lift alone. Others were not so generous. Online, the community fractured in real time. Posts multiplied across every local group, every neighborhood forum, every comment section attached to any article that carried Lily and Jack's names. Half the voices rose in defense of Malehya. The other half came down hard. They argued that the letter wasn't a warning. It was preparation, a document created in advance to establish a narrative in case things went sideways, an excuse dressed up in the language of a desperate mother. The truth was that nobody actually knew, and that uncertainty was its own kind of torment. For the volunteers, the people who had spent weeks walking back roads in the rain, checking drainage ditches, sweeping fields at dawn with flashlights, cutting to the morning fog, the letter felt like a betrayal of a different kind. Not necessarily Malehya's betrayal, but a betrayal by the system that had held information with both hands and said nothing while they searched blind. They had covered miles of ground guided by nothing but hope. And somewhere in an office, behind locked doors, a letter existed that might have redirected every single one of those steps towards something real. The frustration didn't need a target to be devastating. The grandmother stood on the porch of her weathered home and tried to find words that wouldn't shatter in her mouth. She managed only a few before her voice gave way entirely. Her question wasn't angry. It wasn't even accusatory in the traditional sense. It was a question of someone whose grief had nowhere left to go. If she knew, why didn't she speak? For words that hung over Pictou County like smoke. By late afternoon, the steps outside CPS headquarters had become something unexpected, a confessional. The spokesperson gripped the edges of the podium with both hands, her knuckles visible from the cameras, and she didn't reach for comfort or deflection. Her voice stayed level. But the word she chose carried the full weight of institutional failure pressed into a single sentence. We failed to connect the dots. We will not make that mistake again. It was the first honest thing anyone in an official position had said in weeks, and the room received it in total, devastating silence. The admission was only the beginning, because when CPS stepped back from the podium that afternoon, they didn't leave the room in silence and darkness the way official statements usually do. They stayed, and what followed the confession of failure was something that Pictou County had been starving for since the very first day Lily and Jack's names entered the public consciousness. A plan, a real one, not the recycled language of ongoing investigations and active cooperation between agencies, not the carefully worded non-answers that had been trickling out of press conferences for 3 weeks while the community quietly fell apart. This was specific. This was directional. And for the first time, it pointed somewhere new. The search was being expanded. Significantly, new coordinates had been identified, locations that until this moment had never been formally included in the investigation. Forgotten logging trails that wound deep into backcountry, far beyond the roads that search teams have been working since day one. Remote hunting cabins sitting at the end of unmarked paths. The kind of structures that don't appear on standard maps and don't come up in casual conversation, unless you already know they exist. And here was a detail that made the entire room shift forward in their seats. Several of those cabins had direct ties to Daniel Martel's own family. These weren't random coordinates pulled from a geographic database. These were places that people connected to Daniel knew about. Places where someone familiar with that land could disappear and remain invisible for a very long time, provided nobody knew exactly where to look. For weeks, those locations had sat outside the boundaries of the official search. Now, they were at the center of it. The letter had done something investigators hadn't expected. It hadn't just surfaced Malehya's fear. It had stirred something in the community, loosened something in people who had been watching quietly from a distance, uncertain whether what they knew was worth saying. Within hours of the letter's contents becoming public, credible tips began arriving, not the vague, shapeless rumors that had been cluttering tip lines for weeks. Precise details, specific enough to act on, information that suggested someone, somewhere, had been holding back and had finally decided that holding back was no longer something they could live with. The K-9 units were redeployed before nightfall. Their handlers moved with a focus that hadn't been visible in days. Radios low, heads down, following coordinates that now had context behind them. The dogs worked the edges of trails that search boots hadn't touched yet. And for the people watching from the road, from their car windows, from the edges of fields, there was something different in the air that evening. Not relief, not certainty, but momentum. And after 21 days of standing still, momentum felt like a lifeline dropped into a very deep well. The public appeal came directly, without softening. If you see Lily and Jack, call immediately. If you notice anything out of place, any sound where there shouldn't be one, any movement where no movement belongs, do not wait. Do not assume someone else has already made the call. Do not convince yourself it's nothing. Make the call. Every single tip matters, and right now, every hour matters more. Those words landed differently than the previous weeks of carefully measured updates. They landed with urgency, with the kind of directness that tells you the people asking aren't just going through procedural motions. They believe there is still something to find. They believe time is short, but not gone. And Pictou County responded. By the time the sun dropped below the tree line, Main Street had transformed. The candles came back first. Rows of flickering flames appeared along the sidewalk outside the town hall. The same spot where vigils had burned every night in the first desperate week, and then slowly gone dark as exhaustion set in. Now they were lit again. Strangers standing shoulder to shoulder, passing lighters without exchanging names, bowing their heads over small trembling flames. The volunteer sign-up tables filled faster than anyone had seen since the very first days. Retired workers, teenagers, parents who had been keeping their children locked indoors out of a fear they couldn't fully name. They all came. Some arrived with search dogs. Others brought ATVs and laminated maps folded into their back pockets. A few brought nothing except themselves, a phone, and the willingness to walk into cold darkness, if that's what it took. And then the grandmother went live. Her phone camera shook slightly in her hands. A single lamp glowed behind her. She looked directly into the lens without flinching, even as her voice caught on the very first sentence. "We are not done. Do you hear me? We are not done." The video spread faster than any press release ever could. Thousands watched within the hour. Comments flooded in from cities far outside Pictou County. Strangers offered drones, search dogs, vacation days from work just to come and help walk a grid. The community wasn't just responding to news anymore. They were reclaiming belief. And in a town worn this thin, belief is not a small thing. It is everything. For 21 days, Pictou County had been living inside a kind of suspended grief. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly, the way cold settles into a house when the heat goes out. You don't notice it happening until you realize you've stopped expecting warmth. Streets that had once buzzed with search energy had grown quieter. Conversations had grown shorter. The volunteer boards that once overflowed with names had been running half empty for days. People still cared. Nobody had stopped caring. But there's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from chasing absence, from pouring everything you have into a search that keeps returning you to the same unanswered silence. And that exhaustion had begun to show on every face in town. Then the letter surfaced, and everything shifted, not gradually, not in slow stages the way investigations usually move. It shifted the way a fault line shifts, suddenly, completely, and with consequences that ripple far beyond the point of impact. Because the letter didn't just introduce new information. It reframed everything that had already happened. Every welfare check that ended with a closed file. Every teacher observation that sat in a drawer without a follow-up. Every medical flag that was never fully pursued. Every opportunity that had been quietly downgraded instead of urgently escalated. All of it now existed inside a new and devastating context. Someone had seen this coming. She had written it down, sealed it, hidden it, and the system that was supposed to catch exactly this kind of thing had walked past the warning signs so many times that by the time anyone thought to look, the children were already gone. The investigators working the expanded search zones moved with a different energy now. There was no longer any comfort in routine. No more working the same familiar perimeter, checking the same coordinates that had already been cleared. The new locations demanded new thinking, new approaches, new willingness to go further and look harder than anyone had been pushed to look before. The logging trails they were now entering hadn't seen foot traffic in months. In some cases, years. The underbrush was dense, the paths barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest floor, and the cabins at the end of those trails were the kind of structures that exist specifically because someone wanted them to be difficult to find. Daniel Martel knew this land. That was the detail investigators kept returning to, not as speculation, not as assumption, but as documented fact. He had family connections to this territory. He had spent time in these backcountry areas. He understood the geography of disappearance in a way that most people simply don't. And for 3 weeks, while search teams have been working the edges of town, the roads, the fields, and the drainage systems, the places that actually matched the profile where someone with his knowledge would go had been sitting completely untouched. The K-9 handlers worked in near silence, communicating in short bursts over their radios, coordinates traded in low voices. The dogs moved with their heads low and their focus absolute, tracing scent lines through terrain that hadn't been disturbed in long enough that the air itself felt different back there. Older, heavier, the kind of stillness that either means nothing has happened here in a very long time, or that something happened here once and the land has been holding the secret ever since. Back in town, the tip lines were ringing differently. The calls coming in now had a specificity to them that the previous weeks simply hadn't produced. People were naming things, specific things. A vehicle parked somewhere unusual on a night that now seemed significant. A figure seen on a trail that connected to one of the newly identified properties. A conversation overheard that had seemed strange at the time, but had been rationalized away until the letter made rationalization feel like a luxury nobody could afford anymore. Every one of those details was being logged, cross-referenced, and followed up on with a speed and seriousness that had been noticeably absent in the earlier stages of the investigation, because the admission from CPS hadn't just been a public acknowledgement of failure. It had functioned as an internal reset, a signal that the old approach, the one that had produced 3 weeks of nothing, was officially over. The question that hung over every new lead, every new coordinate, every new tip being phoned in was the same one it had always been. Were Lily and Jack still out there? And underneath that question, quieter but present in every room, every search vehicle, every candlelit vigil on Main Street, was the one nobody wanted to ask out loud. How much time was left? The grandmother had said it plainly in her live stream, the one that spread across every platform within hours, the one that strangers in cities hundreds of miles away had shared with their own communities, attaching their own prayers to it like notes tied to a lantern. I don't care how long it's been. We are not done. And the town of Pictou County, battered and exhausted and furious and heartbroken all at once, had decided to believe her. This is where we have to sit with the hardest truth of this entire story. Not the letter, not the failed welfare checks, not the downgraded case files or the missed medical follow-ups or the 3 weeks of searching ground that was never going to yield answers. Those are all painful. Those are all damning in their own right. But the hardest truth is simpler and older and cuts deeper than any procedural failure ever could. Someone knew, maybe more than one person, maybe several people in different capacities, at different moments across the timeline of Lily and Jack's lives, saw something that registered as wrong and made a choice, conscious or otherwise, to let it pass, to file it and move on, to attribute it to something benign, to decide that what they were seeing wasn't quite enough to justify the disruption of acting on it. And in the accumulated weight of all those small decisions, all those moments where the bar for intervention was quietly raised just high enough to step over, 2 children ended up missing. That is not a comfortable thing to hold. It is not comfortable for the investigators who are now retracing every step of a case that should never have reached this point. It is not comfortable for the caseworkers whose names appear on reports that were closed prematurely. It is not comfortable for the teachers and doctors and neighbors who noticed things and reported them, and then watched those reports disappear into a system that processed a concern without acting on it. And it is not comfortable for any of us watching from the outside, because the uncomfortable companion question to all of this is, what would we have done? Would we have pushed harder? Would we have called again when nobody followed up? Would we have escalated, advocated, refused to accept a downgraded risk assessment on 2 children whose faces we knew? Most of us want to believe the answer is yes. But Malehya's letter tells a different story about what happens when fear gets bigger than the system's designed to respond to it. She wrote that letter not because she had run out of options in theory. She wrote it because the options that existed in practice felt either inaccessible or dangerous or both. She had watched the system come and go from her home. She had seen the welfare checks arrive and leave. She had watched reports get filed and cases get closed and the apparatus of protection move on while her fear stayed exactly where it was, rooted and growing. So she wrote a letter, sealed it, hid it somewhere deep enough that the wrong person wouldn't find it, and hoped that someday the right person would. The tragedy is not just that the right person found it too late. The tragedy is that the letter was never supposed to be the plan. It was supposed to be the backup. The final insurance policy of a woman who had already exhausted everything else available to her and was still trying, with the last tool she had, to protect her children from a fate she could see approaching and could not stop. Lily and Jack Sullivan deserve more than a letter found weeks too late in a plastic bin. They deserve the full force of every resource, every tip, every set of eyes, every pair of boots willing to walk an unmarked trail in the dark. They deserve a community that refuses to let their names fade into the background noise of unsolved cases. They deserve to come home. And until they do, this story is not over. It cannot be over. Because the moment we stop treating their absence as urgent is the moment we become part of the silence that surrounded them in the first place. So here is what we are asking of you directly and without any softening. If you know something, say it now, not tomorrow, not after you've thought about it for another week. Now, a vehicle you saw, a conversation you weren't meant to hear, a detail you've been carrying because you weren't sure it was significant enough. Say it, because what feels small to you might be the exact thread investigators need to unravel everything. And if you don't have information, you still have a role. Share this. Put their names in front of new eyes. Let Lily and Jack's story reach the person who's been sitting on something, waiting for a reason to speak. You could be the reason they finally do. Drop in the comments right now and tell us where you're watching from. City by city, country by country. Let this family see exactly how far the search has traveled. Let them see that strangers who have never met Lily and Jack and never walked the streets of Pictou County are still holding on, still watching, still refusing to look away. Because that refusal, that stubborn, quiet, powerful refusal to stop believing, is the only thing that has ever brought missing children home. We are not done. We were never done. And we will not stop until Lily and Jack Sullivan are found. If this story moved you, subscribe right now and share this video immediately. Every share is a new pair of eyes. Every new pair of eyes is another chance. Lily and Jack are counting on all of us